Today is March 6, 2025. My name is Maya Kelly, and I am in Blacksburg, Virginia at the Virginia Tech University Libraries. Joining me for an interview today is, can I please have you state your full name?
Elizabeth Ann Estabrooks.
Do I have your consent to record this interview?
You do.
Just to let you know, part of the process, we can pause or stop at any time. You don't have to answer questions that you don't want to answer, and you will have the opportunity to review this recording and make any necessary changes to the final record. Okay, so to begin, what were the dates of your military service?
From 1977 to 1980.
Can you tell me some about your background and a little bit about yourself?
You mean not military service?
Yeah.
Okay, so I spent almost 30 years. The majority of my career was spent in the field of domestic violence and sexual assault, primarily working with women, but also doing women who were survivors and victims, but also doing research and writing. And that was, policy. That was my whole focus I started in 1993 and I retired in October 2022.
Do you happen to have access to the VA services?
I do. I'm 100% service connected, which means that I have enough disabilities that, or severe enough that I'm considered 100% disabled.
Would you mind sharing your experiences with the VA?
They're up and down. The first time I went to VA would have been, about 20 years ago, and I went into the Boise VA, which has always been known to be one of the more quality VAs in the country. But 20 years ago, there weren't a lot of women using VA. There was not a lot of equity in services or equitability, and or even recognition that women were there and needing care. There weren't even any women health centers in VA at that time, and so when you first go to the VA, they want you to go in and have your initial baseline appointment. So they said, okay, come to Boise VA and have your initial baseline. And I said, okay. So I got to the front desk and I asked where the women's health was. And she said, third floor. So I went up to the third floor. And when the doors opened, there was, mops and buffers, and it was like a janitorial area. And I was standing there kind of shocked, thinking I must be on the wrong third floor. It was kind of bizarre. And I was holding the door open, and so the elevator was making that obnoxious dinging sound. And down at the end of the hall was a woman at a desk, and she said, "Ma'am, can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm supposed to have an appointment with women's health, but I think I have the wrong third floor." And she said, "No, ma'am, this is it." And I continued to stand there and hold the door open. And I said, "Do you mean to tell me that I served in the same military as the men, and they get an entire hospital, and I get a freaking janitor's closet?" And she sighed again and said, "Yes, ma'am, I'm really sorry." And there were 2 or 3 rooms, and they only had curtains on them. So there were these rooms that looked out of this hallway where the janitors did, and all we had was a curtain between us and the janitors coming and getting their stuff. And so and there was, at the time, if a woman was going into the VA, she was getting sexual harassed. It wasn't maybe it'll happen to you. It was without a doubt what was going to happen to you. And we were being called Mister, and just it was very negative at first. And I got good care, but the process and the experience were very negative. And I have military sexual trauma from the overwhelming harassment that I experienced while I was in the military. So you can imagine that being in that environment with all of those men who were saying rude and sexual things to us and accosting us was very unpleasant. Now, fast forward to this day, and that's an entirely different experience. I think it still happens to younger women, but because I'm 66 and I don't have beautiful young skin and all that, it's not as prevalent. But having said that, I don't see it the way I saw it. Like they still take up space and, you know, do man stuff, but and it still can be uncomfortable in certain spaces, like at the VA in DC. They have this one waiting room. It's really small, and they only have 6 chairs in there. And of course, when there's 3 or 4 men in there as a woman, I wasn't comfortable going in. That's just my experiences. But the medical care has improved dramatically. Now they have beautiful women's health centers at all the VAs, and they are recognizing more that there are women have different needs than men. We still have to get a lot of our care outside VA, but it's much better than it was 20 years ago.
That's good to hear. Would you mind sharing maybe some of your experiences in the military that kind of caused your trauma?
Yeah, sure. And I appreciate that you said that caused your trauma instead of caused your MST. I just think it's important that we call things what they are. And so thank you for that. But yeah, when I joined in 1977, and I before 1970, of course, the draft only ended in 75 or 76. And women, in 1948, the Women's Armed Services Integration Act passed, and it limited the number of women who could serve in the military to 2%. And women officers could only be 1% of the military, and they couldn't lead like considered combat troops. And so women's opportunities were very limited, not because we couldn't do it, but simply because, we're inhabiting female bodies. And so when I went in, they were just in the process of dismantling the WACs, the Women's Army Corps. And so I was the women had always done basic training at Fort McClellan. I think it's in Alabama. And so then when WACs was dismantled, we started going regular Army and co-ed basic training. So I was the second wave of women to go through co-ed as regular Army co-ed with men at Fort Jackson. And, it's, so you're in university, you understand like the camaraderie. And so you go into what's called the MEPS Center, and then you get on a bus and you go to your basic training site, to your company. And so, it was the men and women, I always say boys and girls because we were so young, but we were all like laughing and, being 18 and 19-year-old kids. And there was a lot of camaraderie, and we were all in it together. So we get to our company at Fort Jackson, and of course the drill sergeant started screaming at us to get off the bus and calling us names, and we were like, oh, okay, well, we don't know then get into a formation. We were like, I don't know what a formation is, but I'll try. And so then there was the whole company, and the drill sergeants were lined up in front of us. They were all men, and they said, this is we're all in this together. Like, look to your left, look to your right, look to your front, look to your back. These are your brothers and sisters. We're your mommy and daddy. This is safe. We're here for you. We're all here for you. We got each other's backs. And in the very next breath said, and for you females out there, know that we do not believe that females, and they said it the word female makes me cringe, because they said it in such a derogatory way that we knew it was unkind and sexist. And they said, for you females out there, know that we don't believe that females belong in this man's army, and we are going to do everything in our power to make sure that not one of you makes it through basic training. And in that moment, and I never really thought about it until some years later, we could kind of feel the shift with the men that we were standing there, who had before we'd been laughing and joking with, and all of a sudden we were othered, and we had this big red target on our back because it was made clear that they belonged there and we did not, and we were interlopers and intruders. And so we could hear the men like kind of starting to say things mumbled under their breath, and I even heard one guy say, yeah, bitch. And so that was sort of... They were in that moment. They told the men, "You're here. You're good. It's okay." And they said, and these women don't belong here, and so you get to treat them however you want because they don't belong here. And we understood in that moment that, it was not going to go well for us. And so there was a lot of, like, in basic training, a lot of, it wasn't just your normal getting yelled at. It was really misogynistic sexual stuff that was going on. And so I thought, okay, well, it'll be better maybe when I go to my training, because it won't be basic training, because basic training is designed to break you down. And so got out of basic training, went to my advanced individual training in Fort Lee, Virginia. And it was a 12-week program. It was supply services. And I thought, okay, I just got to get out of here sooner. It was designed so that you could advance at your own speed. So I got out in 6 weeks. And I thought, okay. And again, it was really awful. The men would hang out their windows and yell obscenities at us and grab their crotches and do all this stuff. It was street harassment on steroids, and it was overlooked by literally all the NCOs and officers. None of them ever said, "Don't do that." And so I thought, okay, if I just get out of here and get to my regular duty station, it'll be okay. I recited the same sort of speech to myself that I did in basic training. And I got to my regular station in Kitzingen, Germany at Harvey Barracks. And I was the only woman in my company. And I was one of very few women on base. And the harassment was unbearable. It was overwhelming. If I was in uniform on base, literally every minute of every day, I was being harassed and groped and grabbed. And so when it came time to re-enlist, plus the message was still there that, you don't belong in this man's army. And they were still referring to it daily as this man's army. And so I remember one day my CO was a woman, and my XO, the executive officer, was a woman. And I was complaining to the XO because we were standing in the company area, and the men were doing their sexual harassment thing. And I said to her, do something. Like, I don't remember exactly what the conversation was, but the conversation was, this is not okay. And I remember I said something, because by this time I had been in long enough, and I was just cursing at I was fighting back in whatever way I could. And I said to her, this is unacceptable. And she I've never forgotten this verbatim. She said, Estabrooks, you can catch more flies with honey than you can with vinegar. Maybe you should just be nicer to them. And I said I have a dirty mouth. And so even though she was an officer, because by this time I was like, I don't care. I didn't join the army to be treated like this. And I basically, in summary, said, that's never going to happen. And I'm not interested in flies, and I'm not interested in being nicer to them, because it doesn't matter. This is my reaction now, because nice didn't work. And so it just went on and on and on. And we sometimes, a lot of times when more women started coming on, the drivers, I worked at what was called an AK. It was a big shipping yard. We got a lot of transmissions and big equipment in it. And so we worked out there receiving all the parts and equipment. And sometimes we would have to walk through the whole company. So our company was here at this end of the base, at this far end. And we had to walk through the whole base and off the base to get to the AK that was like 2 kilometers or something off base. And at the end of the base was the 164th Armored Division. And when we would walk through there, the men would they would get out of their tanks and stuff, and they would go and they would form a gauntlet that we had to walk through, and they would squeeze it tighter and tighter and tighter until they were practically touching us. And we had to endure that every time we walked to work. And it didn't matter if we complained, nothing mattered. They had permission to continue. One of the men there was an officer, and he was just as involved in it as everyone else. So my experience in the military, for years, all I remembered was the really awful stuff because of that harassment. And I carried that with me, and it turned into military sexual trauma related post-traumatic stress. But I, had it not been for that, I was really good at my job, and I liked the Army. If it hadn't been for the sexual assault and the harassment and the discrimination, I would have stayed. But I knew that I couldn't stay. And by the time it was time for me to choose to re-enlist or not, I had a daughter, and I just thought I can't raise her in this kind of hellish, unhealthy environment. And I knew it was going to have an effect on me too. And it turns out that it didn't matter that I separated. It did have an effect on me and how I parented, and my ability to have relationships and everything. But I didn't realize that until years later when I was in my master's program.
Mm-hmm. Going back to what you said about your superiors not doing anything about the harassment, why do you think that is? Why do you think none of them ever put an end to it?
Because they don't take it seriously, and it's the same today. They don't. We didn't belong there. It's for the men, and it was all, and since that's my field, one of the things that I understand is that it's gendered violence, and so, men are also sexually assaulted, harassed, and raped in the military. And when they are, there's feminine pejoratives used. They're assaulted because they don't meet that macho male standard. And so they are othered. They're girls, they're women, they're all the words you can think of. And it's that misogynistic culture that continues to exist today. And especially in 1977 through 1978, there were so few of us, and because of the built-in discrimination in that culture that they knew we couldn't do certain jobs. We weren't good enough just because we were girls, and we still today hear those conversations when Pete Hegseth was being considered for SecDef, and his comments about women shouldn't be in combat. Well, guess what? Women have been in combat since the American Revolution, and they've done just fine. And but we're starting to hear more of that again, because now they've been given permission by the guy who's the head of the Department of Defense to do that. And so myself and many others expect that the rates of sexual assault will start spiking again. And so I think that they didn't do anything because, for one thing, they were also doing it. They were doing the harassment. They were raping their soldiers. They were doing these bad things. And still today, there's this myth that it's the men who are E4s and E5s and that they're the ones doing all the ugly deeds. But they're not. Women are being sexually assaulted on a regular basis by men in their chain of command. And it's a sick, twisted culture.
What was it like raising your child in the military?
She was only one when I left, so there was not really, much as far as that. I had, you have to make concessions. I was a single mom, and even though Ruth Bader Ginsburg made it possible that women could stay in the military starting in 1975, but they were still really highly discouraging you from staying when you got pregnant. So when I got pregnant and I had to tell my CO, when I showed up to my appointment with her, she had 2 stacks of paper. One was small and one was quite large. And she was trying to force me to sign the small packet to discharge. And I said, I'm not discharging. I'm going to stay for the next year. You're going to pay for my maternity care, my child's first year of health, like everything. And I'm going to save money so when I get out, I am in better shape. And she was very angry that she could not force me to leave the military because she knew she had nothing to stand on. And so it was a challenge. Men just have all the babies they want. They never have responsibility for it unless the courts force them to pay child support. So, my daughter's father didn't have to do anything. He didn't have to go in front of anyone. He didn't have to explain himself. He didn't have to sign any papers. But I had to, and I understand logically, I understand the reason for this because there has to be a way for the kids if the mom gets deployed, right? And so I had to have a daycare provider that would take her 24/7 and keep her for as long as necessary, whether it was a day or 2 weeks or whatever. And then I had to have a woman who was her in-country caregiver person, if you will, her guardian, so that if something happened, if war broke out and the civilians needed to be evacuated from Germany. So my daycare provider would make sure that this woman custody of my child. And then that woman's job was to get her back to the United States to my mother. And so it was snail mail. We didn't have email. And so it took a long time to get all that paperwork in order because it had to be notarized. So, I had to send it to my mom, and so it was a challenge because, I had to be in formation of five. Like I had this daughter, and I had to worry about her if we went out on alert. But she was only one, so I got 6 weeks maternity leave, and then I had to go back to work. And so for women, of course, then they have to worry about their bodies and whether or not, and that's especially difficult for women who come from cultures or heritages where they're large people. Like I have a friend who's German, and she's always like, yeah, we're big women. We're big stock. Like I'm never going to be a small person. I come from big stock. And, and so for like Black women and women who come from cultures and ethnicities where sometimes they have to contend with larger sizes, it can be a real challenge because after you have a baby, you only have this much time to get back into your regular body and to meet the weight and measurement standards. So there's that added challenge to go with it.
Did you or your friends experience any other kinds of discrimination during your time in the service or as a veteran?
Oh, yeah. When the battalion reenlistment officer came to me and wanted me to reenlist, I said I wanted to change out of supply into something else. And he said, we can't do that. And all these men that were reenlisting, they were getting to change their MOS. They were getting to choose stations. They were getting all of it. Some of them were getting bonuses. And I had advanced. I had a lot of certificates and awards, and I had made rank pretty quickly. But what he said to me, because it was okay to say the quiet stuff out loud then, was that I couldn't get those things because I was a woman. And I said, then go away and don't ever bother me again. I will not belong to an institution or organization that so clearly disrespects and hates me. And I am in the U.S. Army. We're supposed to be fighting for, democracy and, and all that stuff. And yet I'm being discriminated against for no reason other than the fact that I'm a woman. So what the men are allowed is different than what I'm allowed, and I won't participate in that. And then women, as a veteran, women, people for years said he, him, his. When it came to veterans, they talked about men as veterans. The men would take up space if women are wearing gear that says veteran or Navy or Army. Then it's, oh, did your husband serve? Oh, did your boyfriend, is your son? People, even in 2025, continue to ignore the service of American women in the military. And we have literally been in the military since the American Revolution. But people always act surprised. They're like, oh, I didn't realize women were serving. Of course you did. You just choose not to acknowledge us. That's all. And then with VA, there's been a lot of discrimination. And part of that is it goes hand in hand with the military rules. So, for instance, in 1992, they passed what was called the combat exclusionary policy that said women couldn't serve in anything that could put them in ground combat. And that had a number of detrimental effects on women. For one thing, it affects your ability to get promotions. It affects, because you can't command certain troops, you can't be in certain places. Also, women who did serve in combat, who were in combat situations, and we began seeing, like even during the Vietnam War, 8 women were killed. And people don't think about that. And their names are on the wall. And as time went on, we started seeing, like especially in the 90s and the first Gulf War, women were being sent to Kuwait and over there, and they were dying, and they were doing the same thing as men. But there seems to still be this pervasive attitude that women shouldn't be in combat. Women shouldn't be SEALs. Women shouldn't. And it's women have, and they've done it successfully, and they've done it quite well. And then we have people who say, yeah, but it's more difficult with women. They have to have separate facilities, and it's like, Okay, so that for them, that's justification as to why women shouldn't be in the military. Okay, well, maybe what we should do then is say the men can't do it and the women can. Like, what if we turned it around that way and said no men, but the women have all the rights and all the abilities? And so what happened was when women went into combat areas and got injured, they would come back and they would apply for benefits, and VA's response was, women aren't in combat. You can't have combat related PTSD. You can't have combat related injuries because women are not legally in combat. So we can't acknowledge your combat injuries and illnesses. So and then of course there's, how it affects your retirement and your retirement. Because if women are making more money when in their younger years, they're going to make less money, or if they're making less money in their working years, they're going to make less money in retirement. Plus, it really did halt the number of women who were getting promotions. I always say, there are only a handful of women who are made it to general or admiral status. And it's not because they're not qualified and capable. It's because of discrimination and those exclusionary policies.
You mentioned that it was okay then to say the little things out loud. What do you think changed to make that okay?
I think that just the overwhelming or the overriding culture changed, and they understood that it was no longer acceptable to do. Like when I was in basic training, the march cadences were very sexualized, and that lends itself to an environment of sexual harassment, which lends itself. There is a correlation between environments of sexual harassment and environments where there's higher numbers of rape. And so when you've got that kind of culture, it's going to feed that culture of rape. And I'm sorry, I can't remember what your question was.
I asked why you think that it was then okay to say the things out loud.
The culture shifted and it became less okay, because in like the 80s is when the movements were with like domestic violence shelters and stuff really started. The laws started getting passed against domestic violence. The laws against marital rape weren't even in effect until the 90s. So as these laws began to take place, it became, people still believed it, but it became less acceptable to say the sexist and misogynist things out loud, just like it became less acceptable to say the racist things out loud. That doesn't mean people weren't racist. It means that they just understood they couldn't say it in public. Right. And that's really what it is.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. You mentioned that the marches were sexualized with the cadences. Do you mind giving me an example and just explaining that?
I can't remember like the cadences. It's been 40 years, 45 years. So, but there were things that were like, just the words that they used were kind of sexualized. And then they would do things like when we were marching past men, or if we were standing and the men were marching past us, or even if we were marching, if they passed us, their drill sergeant would say, I can't remember whatever they call this, eyes right, so that they could all stare at us as we marched past them. And so it was just the whole environment was that it was all about sex. And I'll give you one example. It wasn't about the cadences, but where I was in basic training, we had one big company unit, and the women were on the third floor, and the men were on the first and second floor. And so there's a lot of push-ups involved when you're in basic training. Things, you get it for punishment, for whatever. For doing push-ups wrong, you get more push-ups. There's a whole lot. And so what they would do is while the men were, because sometimes you're doing 30, 50, whatever, they say you're going to do push-ups till I get tired. And so they would have these things that they would say. So there were times when the women would be, like, say, on the third floor in our billets, and they would have us all go to the window and stand there and look out. And the men would be in the company area doing push-ups, and the drill sergeant would be saying things like, come on, guys, you got it. You still got it in you. Like, pretend you're home with your girlfriend and you just got back, and, you don't want to disappoint her. You're wearing your arms out, and they would be making noises and like, let's pretend you're home with your girl and it's the first time you've had sex. And we would have to stand there and watch and listen while the drill sergeants were doing these drills with the men. And so, again, it just harbored that twisted environment that we were there to be sexualized, and the men were there to sexualize us, and and that sort of thing was pervasive.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That makes me really curious then. How do you think that, what changes do you think need to take place to prevent that environment and stigmas that exist in the military, to prevent anything like that ever happening again, or to at least take the right step forward and progress?
And that's a great question, and it's really about, everything flows from the top down. If you have, even if it's a regular civilian workplace or the military, if you have not just rules against it, people who are willing to enact those rules, it's better. If you have a battalion commander and a company officer and executive and first sergeant and all down that chain of command, if those people refuse to allow it, if they actively disallow the pictures of the naked women and the sexual comments and the sexual harassment and the grabbing and the groping and the joking, that it's not really a joke. If they disallowed all of that, it changes that culture so that the men become aware that it can't happen. When the people at the higher levels show respect for the women through policies, through behavior, through disallowing this harassment, it becomes a more equitable environment, and that stuff stops happening. And the way it happens now is because it just last year was there was a policy passed that sexual assault and harassment cases couldn't be handled by the chain of command, which was really important, because if you've got a first sergeant or anybody in that chain of command who is the one perpetrating it or supporting it, or they know that Soldier Joe did this, but they just let it happen. Nothing happens to him. Very few cases are tried in the military of sexual assault, and even fewer have an outcome that benefits the survivor or victim. And so as long as that culture is there, it's going to happen. Now, we know that there are some, in fact, my friend and I were just talking about this last night. If you have a command structure where that just simply isn't allowed, there are lower rates of sexual assault and harassment in that. Whereas if you have a culture or a command where it's allowed, where the generals are doing it and the colonels are doing it and the lieutenants are doing it and the NCOs are all doing it, then it's going to be harmful. It's harmful to the women and it's harmful to the men. And so it's really going to take a determination. Somebody once said to me, well, if the comment they made was, if the military could do something about it, and I said, let's correct that statement. The military chooses not to do anything about it. The military tells you what time to get up, what to wear, how you can speak, whether you can put your hands in your pockets. They tell you how to wear your hair. They command every single thing that every person in their military structure does every day. They choose not to stop harassment, assault, and rape. And it's that choice that has allowed it to persist. They will tell you that the DOD, I think they say 1 in 4, and the VA says 1 in 3 women are sexually assaulted, 1 in 8 men. I say it's all women. And during the time that I worked with women veterans, I worked with thousands of women veterans, and only 3 of them told me nothing ever happened while they were in the military. It's all women that are dealing with assault, rape, and harassment. Not 1 in 3. The military doesn't even like the phrase military sexual assault or military sexual trauma, because they know that means it happened under their watch, but they're not willing to do anything about it.
Can you tell me more about your time working with veterans?
Yeah, so I got my master's in 2013, and during that program, I had never ever seen myself as a veteran. If somebody asked me if I was a veteran, I would say no. I was just a girl who was in the Army. But was I a veteran? No. And I didn't see myself that way because I didn't serve very long, because I wasn't in any kind of deployment like war type situation, and because I was a woman. I just didn't think I was a veteran. And when I served, it was the Cold War peacetime. There was nothing. And so um, for in 2011, when I started my graduate program, I just started focusing on women veterans. And because I had been in the field of domestic violence and sexual assault, I was focusing specifically on interpersonal violence in women veterans. So I started doing all of my research and my writing, and I was published at my school's at the Columbia University School of Social Work Journal, and so when I got out, I got a job. The Oregon legislature had passed a bill to allow for a permanent women veterans coordinator because they understood that women they weren't applying for their benefits at the same rate. They weren't using VA at the same rate. They just weren't involved in anything veteran. And so my job as the women veterans coordinator was to make sure that the women veterans of the state knew that I existed and that they had a right, they were entitled to the benefits that they were leaving on the table. So that was during my time as a women veterans coordinator, and even before that, I became an expert on women veteran issues, their health, their welfare, military sexual assault, and military sexual trauma in particular. And that was because I understood the gravity and the enormity of those things.
How do you work with the woman to reconcile those traumas?
That's a good question. I just wrote a book. It's going to be released on March 18th. And one of the things is, there's so much shame about being raped. And to be clear, the rate of sexual assault in the military is really not any different than the rate of sexual assault in universities and colleges. Universities and colleges are equally responsible because they don't want to admit that that's happening on their campuses, because mommy and daddy might not let their kids go to school at that school if they know how big the rate of assault is, right? And if a person is raped, if a woman is raped or sexually assaulted, you can see, like in the papers and the news, how she's blamed. Nobody ever says he's a bad guy who did a bad thing. Oh, well, he's got his whole future in front of him. He's a good athlete. He's a good student. And she's like a whore. She was drinking. She dresses like a slut. Like, all of those things are said about her. So the shame of sexual assault and harassment is one that women own as victims and survivors. The shame is put squarely on our shoulders, not on the shoulders of the guys who are doing the bad things or the guys who are just standing there silently while it happens. They're as complicit because they're just standing there saying nothing when it happens and doing nothing. They're the lawmakers who aren't doing anything about it, who refuse to pass the laws, who are so worried. And so it's the whole situation is one that becomes untenable because of that shame. And that shame prevents women from saying it happened to them. And it prevents them from filing their claims. I can't tell you how many women I encountered who said, I can't file a claim because then my husband will find out it happened to me and he doesn't know. And so when with the VA, the upside is that some years ago they started acknowledging that military sexual trauma related PTSD and physical health injuries are prevalent among the women veteran population, especially, and so they started they passed a policy that even if you don't have a service connected disability, you can get care and treatment for your military sexual trauma related PTSD or injuries. And that helped quite a lot. But still, women were fearful. They were fearful they had to tell their story. They were fearful they were going to be denied. And I'll give you an example. There was this one woman, her case was very severe. He was actually jailed, and she left. I think she left on a medical, but she was denied benefits, even though there was an abundance of proof through the trial. She was denied benefits, and she was suicidal. I mean, there were so many things, and yet she had been denied benefits, and for a long time women were being denied their military sexual trauma benefits, and because they didn't have proof. Well, there's not proof when it comes to rape, and even sexual assault. It's not something that you're told you can catch more flies with honey than you can with vinegar. It's minimized enormously, and so women learn to tuck that. They learn to stuff it down here and not talk about it and not deal with it, and just carry on. And so when you're face to face with the woman, or when you're talking to a group and you're talking about getting claims, the fear is palpable. The fear that they will be denied, the fear that the shame comes back to them, the knowledge that if they start talking about it, it's going to come out, and it's going to come out hard and big, and it's going to be painful and potentially detrimental to their health. And so what you do, I used to, over the years, I developed a phrase. I would say, tell me what I need to know to help you. And the women would just start talking to me. And I remember this one young Marine, she said, she was on her ankle and her wrist and the physical injuries that she had encountered. And I just waited. And I said, so I'm going to ask you a question that I ask every young woman I speak to, every woman in general, even the 90-year-old women. Did anything happen sexually, like harassment, assault, or rape? Anything that made you uncomfortable? And she said, the usual. And I said, tell me what the usual is. And she said, well, they say things. And I said, and I waited. And she said, and some grabbing and some groping. And I said, okay. And she said, well, and being assaulted sexually. I said, so we've gone from the usual to sexual assault, just like that. And I used to train veteran service officers, and I would say to them, you have to let her speak. If you want to know what happened to her, don't sit in front of your computer typing. Let her speak. Ask her what you can help her with, and then let her tell you. Don't interrupt her. Don't say something like, and so what did you do? Because that's her cue that you're not safe and she's going to shut up. So really, if you making sure that women understand they can go to the VA and get care even if they don't have a service-connected disability. And then, like the one woman that I was leading up to when I interrupted myself, when she finally got her benefits, she was only approved at 70%, and everything in the VA for disability is rated from 10% to 100%. 100% meaning that it's a total disability, and they have all of these little measurement guides. So when she called me, she was just devastated. Most people are excited. They're happy that they got their benefits. And she said, that means they only believe me 70% of what I said. In her mind, her story and her experience was invalidated because the VA, even though it was such a severe case and there was a court case that fully described everything he had done to her and the trauma she had experienced and the suicidal ideation, all of that, she believed that the VA only believed her 70%. That was how she internalized that. And so to your question, the only thing you can really do is give them space and make them feel safe and understand that the shame is not theirs. The shame is the men who do it and the men who stand by and allow it every minute of every day. The men who stand in colleges and on the street and in the workplace and in the military, who stand there and say nothing while their peers are doing these bad things to women. And it's just something that you have to just work with them. I had one woman when we started her claim, when she was one of my very first cases when I got to the Department of Veterans Affairs in Oregon. She didn't finally concede to writing her claim until about 3.5 years later. We had made several goes of it. We'd start writing and then she would stop and she would go, I can't do this. And it had to be on her terms. She had to come to a place where she felt safe enough and secure enough that she could take that step forward and that she could, she'd gone to some treatment for substance abuse, but she just wasn't ready to open up that can of worms.
What are some of the reasons that they're denied service and their benefits.
Lack of proof was the big one, and it was a battle. You no longer have to have proof. They have what they call markers. Like, can we? She said this happened. So how do we? A marker can be like, how did her behavior shift? Can we show that she asked for a transfer? Can we show that she started having medical problems? I had this one young woman who was denied, and because there was no proof, and she hadn't gone in. She hadn't, a marker could be a pregnancy, it could be an STD test, and she was denied because she didn't have any of those apparent markers. And I looked through her medical file, and I saw that after the sexual assault, she had started having headaches. She started going to the doctor frequently for her migraines. She started being unable to go to work. She started getting in trouble because her uniform wasn't squared away. And I was like, every one of these. Before this, she didn't have any of these issues. This happened, and then all of these things started happening. And we resubmitted it to the VA with these things, pointing out these things, and they said, oh, yeah. And she ended up getting her service-connected disability because we were able to clearly define the markers and the moments in time that changed after that sexual assault happened.
Do you think it would be better for the VA, or what are your opinions on the VA's markers in a sense with the percentages? You said that some veterans can get passed with a higher percent for their service, but do you think that all women veterans should get 100% service, or do you think that the markers with the percentages serve a purpose?
So the markers are not really related to the benefit level. So the markers just identify whether or not you're eligible, whether or not something happened. But then there's also, it's not just did it happen, but how is that affecting you today? Like, how does that impact your life today? And that's the same whether it's a knee or an ear or whatever. How is it impacting your day-to-day living? So what they do is they have like a 10%, 30%, and all up to 100%. So 100% is like nightmares, insomnia, unable to work, unable to be in public places. Like basically it's fairly crippling. And whereas 10% might be I don't even remember. It's like maybe insomnia, a couple of things. And so part of the importance of it is, as women, we're taught to say, I'm fine. Everything's fine. I'm good. I'm fine. I'm good. I'm fine. Everything is fine here. And so that's what we're taught. And so when a woman goes in, and they're hesitant to tell their story, which they don't have to tell their stories, but they when you ask them how they are when they go in for it's called the comp and pen exam, a CNP exam. It's when you have to have an examination with the psychologist to determine what kind of impact, like, we know this happened to you, but does it affect your life today? And so the job of the psychologist is to determine that. And so a woman will go in for her comp and pen. How are you? I'm fine. And they won't talk about the fact that last night they didn't sleep. They tossed and turned. That they've had 5 failed relationships. That they weren't they don't talk about any of that. I'm fine, they say. And so the psychologist will say, well, clearly it's not impacting her life. So we're only going to approve her. Yes, it did happen to her and it is affecting her, but we're only going to give her 10%. And so, I always tell women when I know they're going in, I'm like, you're not fine, sister. You don't go in there and say, I'm fine. Go in there, and if you want to, they don't cry, because part of that is they're veterans. I got to be tough. I can't cry. And so I tell them, if you want to cry, cry. If you want to be angry and curse about what happened to you, do that. Don't curse at the psychologist. That would be bad. but they need to know that, your life sucks, that your relationship's falling apart, that you don't sleep, that you have nightmares. I used to have for years, because of the field I was in, I didn't dream at all. I had a recurring nightmare, and it was more of an auditory nightmare. I would hear women screaming, and I would wake up and I would think a woman is being assaulted. And I would go and I would look out the window and I would stand there for a long time and think, okay, maybe I was dreaming. And I never knew, what do I do? Call the police and say somebody is screaming? So for years, that was my nightmare, is that I would wake up to the sound of a woman screaming. And part of that was my vicarious trauma from the work I had done from listening to those thousands of stories on top of my own trauma over those decades. And then when I stopped doing that work, those nightmares ceased. So it's, a lack of sleep and insomnia, all of that stuff, it has an impact on you, and it determines whether or not and how much disability you get.
What service does the VA offer to help with mental health and for veterans in general?
So for mental health, they have, and to their credit, VA has really done a good job of doing some of the groundwork and the really defining work around post-traumatic stress, because it wasn't until I think it was like the 90s or something when they even started using the phrase post-traumatic stress, and so they developed therapeutic models on working with people who are survivors of sexual assault. They developed therapeutic models on post-traumatic stress, and most of them, they do a great job. They have psychologists whose only job is military sexual trauma. And so they're pretty safe people as a rule. The problem is there are too few. We don't have enough budget. They don't have enough time. And in the, some years ago, I can't remember when, it used to be when you started therapy, you could go for like your whole life if you needed to. And then the field sort of said, well, 6 weeks, 8 maybe, unless you have like complex PTSD or something, you don't really need to go for your whole life or for very long. And so veterans found that they were being cut off, like right when they were getting to it. I went to a therapist for probably 2 months before she, even though in my file it said that I had these experiences, before she ever acknowledged my military sexual trauma. And it was because I brought it up. And then she was like, oh my, so she connected me with a psychologist who did military sexual trauma, PTSD work. But there are so many more veterans now who are using those services, who are using mental health services, which is good because we want to get rid of that stigma, right? But there are too few psychologists and social workers in the VA. So it could be 6 weeks. You could only maybe have an appointment every 6 weeks. And now with everything that's happening with this administration, they're planning on firing another 83,000 people, and they keep trying to assure us that, they're not going to be critical person. It's a person who is administrative on. Well, but that matters, right? Like it all matters. It's all part and parcel. And so they have these really good services, but there are just too few. So not enough veterans can get the care that they need.
How has the care that you've received evolved over time with the VA?
You mean the mental health or just care in general?
Care and mental health?
Okay, so it's gotten better. There are with the women's health clinics, the physical health services got better. And sometimes that can depend, because just because you get care at this VA, if you move to this VA, that doesn't mean that they're going to follow those protocols. Like I had a woman when I was at the Center for Women Veterans, she was from Phoenix and she had some severe health problems. And she had an entire team of medical providers, psychologists, everything were on her team when she was in Phoenix. And then she moved, and that hospital in Atlanta, she was scheduled for surgery because they had tried all of these other things over 2 years. And finally they said, you need surgery. We've tried everything else. So she goes to this new hospital. They said, oh, no, we're not going to follow their protocol. You have to start over. And we have to see if any of these things work. And I contacted them. I said, she's already been down that road. This woman needs a surgery. So her solution was she moved back to Phoenix. She pretended she was moving back so she could get her surgery. And then she moved back to Atlanta. And so that's a problem, is that they say it's all one, but each hospital is autonomous, and their providers don't have to follow the protocol of the other providers you've already seen.
Why is that?
I don't know. It's their protocol is for every hospital to run individually under these guidelines. Well, they don't have guidelines that say if she's or he has already been seen for this and they move, you have to continue that treatment. And I personally, I think part of it is doctor ego, like, because they want it to be about them. And I honestly, I think that's part of it. Where just get the file and say all of this is, interview her, do an assessment, but don't make that person go through all of that again, especially if it's something like a 2-year delay. And so, that is not getting better. That protocol is not getting better. The care is improving for the most part. It depends on the VA you're at. The care might suck depending on the VA you're at. Some VAs, like, I'm sure I don't know if you remember that when what happened with the Phoenix VA, and it was a hot mess. And they got a new director, and part of it is the director. They got a new director in there to fix it. And I've been, like, when I was at the Portland VA, it was a good VA, and then this director took over, and she ruined it. And then a new director took over, and he made it amazing again. And then another director, they sent him somewhere else to fix some other hospitals. And then another director came on board, and it went downhill again. So they, in Kansas, at one of the Kansas City or Kansas VAs some years ago, there was a huge thing about how the director had contributed to a very racist environment, and how the veterans of color were being maltreated, like all kinds of stuff. Well, instead of firing him, the VA just sent him somewhere else to cause the same problems at a different VA. And that is the problem. They're firing all of these, like, probationary, these lower level employees, when the big problems that I witnessed at VA are the executive management forces that are doing a poor job of implementing things. As far as mental health treatment, the field has evolved. So used to be, there was I can't remember what the treatment modality was called, but you had to tell your story. Telling your story will help you. It'll help you in your recovery and in your treatment, and you'll feel better. Well, now they're saying, that was a really bad idea. Good thing we're not doing that anymore. Now people who have trauma aren't required to tell in detail what happened to them, because they understand that the damage that results from that is pretty high level. So modalities have changed as the field has changed.
Okay. Sorry to go back and switch gears a little bit, but I'm really curious, why did you decide to join the military in the first place during the time that you did?
So that's actually a good story, because, for a long time I didn't talk about it because everybody was like, I just wanted to do something for my country, patriotism. And that's great. And that's good. But that wasn't why I joined. So I thought, well, I'm a bad person because that's not why I joined. So it was 1977, and we were in the middle of a humongous recession. And I had a car payment, and I had a job for years, even though I was only, 18 years old. I had a job for years. And I was working at this financial office, and I went on an interview, and I got another job with better money and higher status. And so I was like, yay. So I gave my notice at this place, and they hired someone. And about a few days or week, I don't remember how long before I was supposed to take my other job, they called and said, sorry, we gave your job I gave your job to my friend's daughter because she really needed a job. So here I was in 1977, when it was hard to find a job and there was a recession and cars were lining up for gas, with no job and no money, and a car payment and rent. And my friend Joy, she was my roommate. She came home one day and she's like, I have a great idea. Let's join the Army on the buddy system. And I was like, hell no. And she had the brochures, and she was like, we could do the buddy system, we can travel, and she was making it sound pretty good. And so I agreed to go to the recruiter's office with her. She was a single mother of 2 children, and at the time you could not join the military if you were a mother. Even though you could stay in once you got pregnant, you couldn't join. And so the recruiter, when that came up, we were sitting there together, and he was like, you got to give up custody of your children in order to join the Army. And she was like, oh, what? That's not going to happen. He said, oh, it's not permanent custody. You could, like, can you give them to your mom or an ex? And she said, It's not shoes, it's my children. I'm not giving them up. And so she said, I'm out. And so I said, "Yeah, okay, I'll do this." So that's how I ended up joining the Army, because I needed a job, and they made it sad that the education benefits, which really sucked, they made that sound good, and you can travel, and you get a paycheck, but you're living in a dorm, and it all sounded pretty attractive because recruiters lie. It's what they do.
They did a good job selling you then.
They sure did.
Well, can you tell me then a little bit about what sucked about the education? You mentioned that the education wasn't good. Why was that?
So at the time, it was called the Montgomery Bill. I think it was like the Montgomery GI Bill or something. And so it was very limited how much you could get. And you had to put in a certain amount of money in order to access it. And so I got out of the Army. I had this, 1-year-old child, and it was like, at the time, they didn't have online education or anything like they do now, and you had to be someplace where there was a college that you could attend. Plus, there was working. How was I going to raise my baby? So I just didn't. I didn't go to college. And when I finally, so my daughter I had my son when she was 13, and so by the time I wanted to go to college, when he was only like 3, and online colleges were starting, so I was like, I can do this. But my benefits had ended because they were only good for 10 years. So I ended up with student loans for my undergraduate and for my graduate school because I had no military educational benefits. So for 9/11, it got better. Congress approved millions of dollars. And so I always tell people, I'm like, the dependents of today's military members have better educational benefits than I had as somebody who is a veteran.
Mm-hmm. Wow. On that note, what advice would you give any women that are entering the military now?
I always tell them, don't do it until the military chooses to do something about the rate of sexual assault. I tell every young woman, and I even tell young men, don't do it. It's not a safe place for you. You probably, I tell the women, you will probably be raped. Just know that if you go into the military, you will probably be raped or at the minimum sexually assaulted, and you will most certainly deal with harassment. It's not a safe place for you. You'll face discrimination even in the year 2025. Don't do it.
One of the things you said earlier that I found very upsetting was you mentioned that you had a superior officer who was a woman who didn't really do much for you when you complained about the sexual harassment you were facing. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on the culture changes that need to happen in order for leadership in the military, and specifically female leadership in the military, to kind of burden this challenge.
Well, and I think, unfortunately, the women who are leaders they are in that military environment, that masculine environment. And so part of the reason they do that is they don't want it to appear that they're using, as a woman, they're coming down on the side of women. So there's that fear. That's part of the culture. And we see that internalized sexism and misogyny even in the civilian world. But the harm that it causes is that sometimes they're even more difficult when women are being sexually assaulted and harassed. And I have even seen some women who are officers who say, yeah, it happened to me and I got over it. And so that's part of the harm, is that misogyny spills over to women because it becomes internalized misogyny, and they're there to save themselves. They're there to, their focus is on military preparation, and the problem is that leadership don't see sexual assault and harassment and rape in the military as something that impacts military readiness, and it does, and because a lot of it is that you have to be able to rely on those people that you're serving with. You have to trust them. And if you've been sexually assaulted or harassed, that there is no trust. If then you have the institutional betrayal. If you go to your people, your chain of command, and you tell them something's happening, and you don't get care and you don't get justice, and they turn on you, that institutional betrayal, studies have found repeatedly that institutional betrayal can exacerbate post-traumatic stress. It can make it all so much worse. And so for women who are leaders, my message to them is always do better. Don't be ashamed or embarrassed to stand up for your women that are serving under you. Don't be afraid to stand up to the men, and especially to the men who are doing this stuff. Like, do you have to sacrifice your career? I don't care. Like, do the right thing. But that's just me. So I think it's really about recognizing that the harm that's being done. And when you are a woman who goes to a woman and they give you that their message, or they ignore you, it makes it that much worse that it's coming from another woman.
Similarly, but not entirely related, I'm curious, you mentioned earlier about the statistics on sexual assault in the military, and of course you have a background dealing with this, not just as a veteran, but after that. Can you enlighten me a little bit about what the statistics look like, and if sexual assault in the military has, what that trend has looked like in the last 20 to 30 years?
So, they never really started measuring it until it was about the time of Tailhook, which was in 1994, I think, or 92. Tailhook, it's a big Navy convention, and 70 women were sexually assaulted during that convention. And that was the first, this was part of the paper that I had published. That was really the first event. Sexual assault has been happening since the whatever. But Tailhook was the thing that made the papers. It was the thing that first brought sexual assault, harassment, and rape in the military to the media's attention, and thereby to the public's attention. And so after that, it was like committees and meetings and task forces and more committees and more meetings and more task forces. There's like this whole timeline where you can see it all unfolding. And the rate since they started measuring has never really gone down. We've seen it go up, but we've never really seen it decrease. And today they like to say, "Oh, it's gone down." No, women, even though they made different avenues for reporting, women are discouraged from reporting. They go in and they're discouraged. Are you sure you want to do this? This could be bad for your career. It could be bad for his career. Are you sure you want to report this? Maybe go sleep on it. And so it's not that the rate has gone down. And I learned this because the women that are leaving the military today have the same stories as the women who left during the Vietnam War and during Korea and during all of those other times. Today, we know for a fact, data is showing us, men are enlisting at a lower rate now. Women are enlisting at a higher rate, and Black women in particular. But women are also discharging at a higher rate. And the survey shows why? Because of harassment, assault, and rape in the military, and the discrimination, because it's an unsafe place for women. So and this is part of the military readiness thing. So we don't have enough troops. We don't have enough people enlisting because people are like, "Oh, hell no. I'm not going to go to war. I'm not going to do that. That's not for me." But women are still going, "Yeah, I'll do it." And part of that, I think, is that in 2013, Leon Panetta got rid of the combat exclusionary policy and said, "Y'all have 3 years to make it so that women can be in any field." So it blew the doors open. So now 100% of the fields in all branches are open to women. And I always say, when women can, we do. And that women started enlisting. I spoke to a woman who was the top Marine recruiter in the United States about a year after that happened. And she said, "You can't believe the number of women that I have coming to my door going, I want to be in an infantry field." Because they could. After 200 plus years, we were giving allowance to do that. And I think that it's something that we need to consider is how is that sexual assault and awareness affecting that bigger picture. And I don't think that the military, I don't think they still take it seriously enough because the rates aren't going down. And because it's still people in the chain of command doing the deeds or ignoring it entirely. And I think until they choose to make it a priority, in the 1970s, I think it was the 70s, it was called the Lautenberg Amendment was passed. And I was in the field of domestic violence at the time, and we celebrated the Lautenberg Amendment, but military and law enforcement lost their individual and collective minds, because what it said was, if you have a domestic violence or sexual assault charge against you that is even a Class C felony, you can't have a gun, you can't own a weapon, you can't fire, you can't hold a weapon. But the military was like, we can issue waivers. And so even today, and just about a year ago, I was researching this, and every branch has their own waivers guideline. They have a set of waivers guidelines for enlisted and a set of waivers guidelines for officers. And basically what it says is that if it's for the good of the order, they can allow people in who commit sexual assaults and domestic violence acts. The Lautenberg Amendment doesn't hold any water. And as long as that's the case, in the early 2000s, the Army was suffering what they called a manning issue, which is to say they didn't have enough people joining. So they started issuing waivers to sex offenders. And so we have people that are known sex offenders that the Army was welcoming in. What do you think is going to be the outcome? It's just like there's only one outcome. There's only one way that's going to go.
Wow. Sounds like there wasn't much protection for women, period.
No.
And do you think that that's changed? Have there been anything to improve those conditions?
No. Because the military is not interested in changing it. They just simply don't care. They like their culture. They will tell you, die hard, they will tell you that culture has to stay in place to have an effective military. And there are some of us going, no, what you have is an ineffective military with betrayal and trust issues, with gendered violence happening under the blessing of the U.S. government every single minute across this world while people are wearing uniforms. Women in the military are in more danger of the people that they're serving with than they are anyone else. And domestic violence is huge in the military. There are women who are being battered frequently by their partners, both of them in the military, but they will protect the male almost always. Unless it's so severe that they can't overlook it. Unless it's so horrible. Think about the Vanessa Guillen case. That they didn't want to have anything they didn't want to admit it, they didn't want to talk about it. They put that off for a year, 6 months, and even still they made a lot of excuses as to why they didn't do anything. I saw this one woman, she said if a member of their force had left a gun in the field, they would have rallied all the troops. Nobody would have slept until that weapon was recovered. But if a woman goes missing, they're like, "Oh, what's for dinner tonight?" They don't rally the troops. They don't do anything. They just ignore it. So that's really what it's about.
How has your time in the military affected your relationships?
Oh, terrible. My trauma that still lives with you because it doesn't go away, gave me a very colored view of men, and it wasn't just. It's like I said, men are complicit. Even though it wasn't all the men doing it. All the men participated in that. The men who weren't doing it just stood by silently and said nothing, and that bleeds into VA. That same idea and mindset bleeds into VA. I was at an appointment at the Washington, D.C. VA one time. I was in the physical therapy room, and I was sitting here, and there were two men to my left and a man across from me, and then the check-in window to my right. And whenever I would go into the VA, I always made sure I had like my Kindle and my headphones, and I wasn't listening to anything and I wasn't reading anything because I had to be alert to what was going on around me. And I heard the man who was to the far left say, "Hey, beautiful, want to get some coffee?" And I ignored him. And I was like this, and I had my legs crossed like this. And he said something, and he continued to say something, and pretty soon I was aware that he got up out of his chair and he came around and he was standing right in front of me. And he said, "Hey, I asked you if you want to get coffee." And I ignored him. He was saying stuff. And then he said, "Hey, bitch, I'm talking to you." And he took his cane and he swung it and hit the bottom of my foot. And I took out my headphones and I put down my Kindle and I said, "Motherfucker, you touch me with that cane again and I will kill you with the fucking thing." And even when he did that, nobody in the room, not one, the men didn't say, "Dude, sit down," nothing. Nobody at the check-in window said anything until I responded and threatened to kill him with his cane. Then finally somebody came out and said, "Oh, let's go back here." And she said, "Are you okay?" I was like, "No, I'm not okay. I was just assaulted in your waiting room. Like, how do you expect me to say yes, I'm okay?" It's like, so it's pervasive in both places. It's getting better at VA, but it's still pervasive in the military.
Do you have a memorable story about an experience in the Army that you think about, maybe positive or negative?
The positives are that, like, was me excelling at my work. So they had this thing called Reforger, and we worked with troops from around the world, and it was basically it's a war exercise. And we did that twice, and because of my position and because we were where we were and what we did, we were a primary factor in that. And I helped, like, I got some commendations for it. I helped get us to the place where we excelled. And, and then, like, when I was pregnant, they didn't want me out of that AK anymore because of the danger and the dust. And so they put me in a warehouse my job was to bring order to the madness. And I did it in about 6 months. And I did it really well, and I got a commendation for that. And so, and the men, when I first went into the warehouse, the men were like, "Rah, rah, 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 this girl's going to tell us what to do, rah, rah, rah." But then they, like, I had a plan, and we did it, and they were, and it was really it wasn't me. It was like, we did this. You guys, like, I just directed you. You did all this work. You made sure that all the little washers and bolts were separated in their own little tins. You did this work, and that was something that we did together. So, and then we traveled a lot. I got to see, like, the castles, and we went to Dachau, and I got to see a lot of Germany and Austria. And so those were good memories. But for a long time, it was so overwhelmingly negative that I couldn't, those things had no place in my memory until I was like, yeah, but good things happened too. And I have one friend from there that I'm still in communication with. But that's it. I lost track of everybody because when I got out, it was like, I just was like, I have to just keep living my life. I've got a child to raise. I've got work to do. And when I came home and I would tell stories about things that happened, people, like, even if it was about sexual harassment, people would laugh and make it into a joke. So I just really stopped talking about my military service because it was just so negative. And all these other people, and I was comparing myself to others who had been in, they all had these really like, "Oh, this happened," good camaraderie. And they had all these great stories. And I thought, well, maybe it was just me. Maybe it was just me. And so now I think what's happened is through things like this and through podcasts for women veterans, women are being allowed, they're being given space to say the quiet things out loud, to say, this is the shitty thing that happened when I was serving in the U.S. military. Yeah, I had some good times, but the discrimination and the assault and stuff was just overbearing, and I couldn't with that. And this is how it affected me.
It sounds like now women are given more space to have a voice
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
And that's a good improvement, at least.
It is. It is, because we're starting to hear, if you listen to the podcasts that women veterans are on, you're starting to hear those truths come out. Whereas before it was like, oh, la, 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 la.
Yeah, all the things that have been covered, brushed under the mat are now
Are now out
brought
there.
to light.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. So, hopefully that'll help it get better.
Yeah.
I'm curious, in your time following your service, when you were working with other veterans, did you ever encounter anybody who was affected by the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policies?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Can you tell us something about that?
That was huge. There's a woman, her name is Margaret Witt. She's from Portland. I'm from Oregon. She's from Portland. And she wrote a book called Tell. And she was kicked out. She was honorable. She was a flight nurse who had done some amazing stuff. She had a sterling career. And they found out she was a lesbian, and they gave her the boot. And her court case, it took her 7 years she battled for 7 years. She said one time she was speaking, and she said basically she just woke up and said, no, this is not that day. I'm not going to let you do that to me. And so she fought back, and her court case, there had been other court cases brought by other people who were in the LGBTQ community, but her court case, she won, and her case helped dismantle Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So that was a really good case. But then I met people like we used to go to have a booth at the Pride Parade. Portland's got the second largest LGBTQ population in the nation, next only to San Francisco, and they have a wonderful Pride event all throughout June, and so they have a huge parade. And so we would go. And we'd staff a booth at the Pride Parade, and so all of these, we had flags, everything. We wanted to make sure that LGBTQ veterans were stopping at our booth, and that happened a lot. And I can't tell you the number of times people talked about they were dishonorably discharged, and the code, there were like 14 codes that they used to secretly discharge. People think Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a harmless policy, but what it didn't matter if you told or not. They actually, it was like the SS of the military. People were it was very subversive. Margaret said, you couldn't, like, if you were a woman and you owned a motorcycle, they would identify you as a lesbian. If there were certain things that you had to be careful, like the people who were lesbians, another woman was telling me this. She said, I played baseball. I stopped doing that because lesbians play baseball. Like all of these different things. Like she said, I made sure not to have any diaries or any photos of me with women, because if somebody came in and saw that, then, I would be turned in, and I would be thrown out. And that once in a while, like, they put homosexuality as the reason for discharge, even if it was an honorable discharge. So one of the things that happened is veterans stopped. Those veterans wouldn't apply for their benefits. They wouldn't use their 5% federal, what's it called? It gives you like 5 additional points for being a veteran, because you have to show your DD 214 for many things, and they didn't want it to show that they were discharged for homosexuality. They were like, it's not like I'm not proud. I'm not in the closet, but handing that DD 214 to a potential employer or something just didn't set well, and so they had really negatively harmed and that's redundant, but they had harmed all of these people. And I remember this one guy that stands out. I was heartbroken. He was a Vietnam veteran, and he clearly had a lot of physical issues going on. And he was telling us, and he had a dishonorable discharge. They had thrown him out because he was gay. And so all of these injuries that he sustained in Vietnam, he had lived with over the decades, knowing that he couldn't go to VA, he couldn't get any care. He didn't tell anyone that he was in the military because he had a dishonorable discharge. So they just dumped all this shame and pain on all of those people who were discharged, either honorably or general or dishonorably. And it it affected people's real everyday life, like this gentleman. And so we were just like, it was basically a group cry. We were like, oh my God. And so we said we could help you get this reversed because, you know, in the early part of the 2000s, they started looking at how they could reverse those negative discharges. My concern is that this administration, like the VA had set up a whole different section so they could examine all of these people who had received negative discharges so they can see if they could help them. Under this administration, because they have such hate for the LGBTQ population, that section may well be dismantled. And so it's going to be a huge setback for the tens of thousands of people who were discharged for no reason other than they were in the LGBTQ community.
Wow. It's a horrifying unknown right now.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I did actually this is only tangentially related, but you mentioned earlier that you had a book coming out, and I just wanted to give you the opportunity to say the title of that book.
Oh, thank you. It's called Broken in the Stronger Places, From Resilience to Resourcefulness. And I have a master's in social work, and so, you know, that, and I did all those years of work. I don't know, do you want me to talk about it?
Yes.
Yeah, please.
Please.
Thank you. So there's an art form called kintsugi. Kintsugi, I think is how it's properly pronounced. And a lot of people don't know that's the name of it, but you see that like the porcelain pieces that have the gold scars that have been broken and repaired. And it's repaired through a process of lacquer, sanding, lacquer, and then you take a like gold powder or something you put over the top of it. So this broken piece has this beautiful repair. And one of the things that they say about those pieces is that they are actually stronger in those broken places because the lacquer and the precious metal powder has strengthened those pieces. And furthermore, that scar simply in that break simply add to the value and the history and the beauty of this piece. It acknowledges that something bad happened, but it's been beautifully repaired. And so in the early 90s, the field of the mental health field developed a theory around a metaphor around that. And they said through therapy and treatment and all of this stuff, you too can be stronger in your broken places. And I believed that for a long time. And then after years of working with all of these women who were victims and survivors, who had all of this, you know, they had post-traumatic growth, they had everything. But at some point, something happened that triggered and re-traumatized them. And those stronger places shattered. And it's my memoir. It starts from the time I joined the Army until I left VA in 2022, and then I did a healing solo journey in a van around the country and into Baja. And so it's my memoir that covers that period, but it's also a professional examination of what I learned from all of these women who were survivors and victims, and what I learned about trauma and post-traumatic stress from them, and more importantly, re-traumatization. So if we put trauma on a continuum like this, and the trauma is here, you have all the recovery and the healing and the therapy, and then you even have post-traumatic growth. But we never examined this section, and this section is like the re-traumatization, the triggering. And when you're doing all of the therapy and you're doing all the work, nobody talks to you about this could happen. You could be re-triggered. You could be re-traumatized. This can be really detrimental to you. And again, as women, we self-blame. We take things on ourselves. Like, I suck. I'm a sucky mom. I'm a sucky employee. I suck. And so it's easy for us when we experience this re-traumatization, we think, I'm doing therapy wrong. I'm too weak. I'm not resilient enough. I'm not taking care of myself. But that's a natural part of that process, that re-traumatization, that becoming broken in the stronger places can happen, and it does. And part of that is my personal experience. I left the Army, and 10 years later, I started in this field working with women who had been victimized and were survivors of interpersonal violence. And I listened to or read and researched thousands of stories. So I had all of this trauma that like I always say, my soul is just filled with trauma stories. Some of the people can't imagine the brutality that offenders are capable of until you start hearing all of those stories. And then I was at the VA. I was at the VA Center for Women Veterans, and a series of events happened. And I was starting to feel my stronger places break. I was like, and I talk about this in my book about, I would, when I would get dressed every morning, I would make sure I put on more lacquer and more gold. And I did all of this so I could keep doing my job because the women needed me and I needed to do my work. And then I shattered. I ended up walking out at a meeting. I just shattered into a million pieces. And my trauma had become so severe. My psychologist was like, you can never hear another story. You spent 30 years in the field on top of your own trauma, and it had a severe impact. You have complex PTSD that includes your trauma and the vicarious trauma from all those decades of taking in all of those stories and doing all of that work. And so when I left my job and I was living in my van, the phrase had already come to me, and so I decided to start writing, and I started writing my book. And so now it's about all of that, and it's also, as I was writing it, I realized I was thinking about the woman who said they only believe me 70%, because validation, especially if you're a survivor, validation that this bad thing happens and you have justifiably you have this response, this human response. Validation of that is so important. And I was thinking when I was writing it, I hope that the people who are survivors, who have trauma residing inside of them, can feel some validation when they read this and go, oh shit, yeah. That happened to me. I thought it was just me, but it turns out it's a thing. So that's what my book is about.
That's a beautiful metaphor.
Thank you.
It sounds incredible.
Thank you.
I'm interested. You started talking about it a little bit, but I didn't know if you could elaborate. Did you find anything particularly influential or healing with your trip out in your van?
I did. So when I left VA, I was in DC, and I was a mess emotionally and mentally. I was taken. The VA had prescribed some drugs because I had also developed anxiety. In addition to, my depression had become very severe, and I had anxiety, and I was just dealing with and my integrity was being stretched thin, and by the VA and that work. And it's funny because I looked it up when I was writing the book. I remembered when I was planning my escape from DC, people would ask me, they would say, when I met them on the road, oh, where are you from? And I would say, I'm escaping from DC. And that was the phrase that I would use. And I remembered that when I was staying with some friends and I was preparing my van, and I remember thinking how cold it was, and that I just needed to go someplace warm. If I got someplace warm where there was sunshine, I would feel better. And so I looked up what the weather was then, and it was like 50, 55 degrees. It wasn't cold, but my soul was so frozen from all of that work and my trauma that all I could think was I have to go someplace. And I remember when I was driving, I drove down to Florida. I left at Thanksgiving and I drove down to Florida. And I remember it was probably a few months before I actually became really aware. I would be driving and I was like, and I had a dog at the time, and I would think, oh, she would do something. I would think, oh, it was the stuff the day-to-day minutia that gets you through. I have to stop so she can use the bathroom. I have to feed the dog. I have to eat. I have to use. It was just the stuff that kept me alive. And then I'd be driving and I'd think, oh, there's traffic. Oh, I have to do. Oh, my map said to turn. And I was really robotic. And I remember, oh, there's the ocean. And the ocean has always been my happy place. But I was like, oh, there's the ocean. Oh, there's palm trees. Oh, it's sunny outside. And it was at least a month before I sort of started coming out of that. And then over that, I was in my van for 10 months. And then my dog died a sudden, horrible death. And all I could think was, I have to sell this van. I can't do this without her. So I immediately sold my van for a lot less than it was worth, just so I could get out of it. But but fortunately, I had spent that 10 months doing an amazing amount of healing. And that's the resourcefulness that in my book I talk about. Like, resilience is really what you have that helps you. When you're in trauma, when you're growing from trauma, resourcefulness is what helps you know what you need to do in the moment. And what I needed to do in that moment was get the hell out of there in my van and live by myself. People say, "Oh, you must have met a lot of people." No, because my trauma and my concerns about men and strangers is so deep that if I didn't talk to men, I didn't talk to it like I would talk to other women if they were by themselves. But it was just a really, it was an interesting time, but I did do a lot of healing then.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for sharing your story with us. Is there anything we didn't touch on during this interview that you would like to talk about or explain more?
No, I think I covered a lot. Maybe more than I should have. I don't
No, that was
know.
incredible. Thank you so much for coming
You're
and
welcome.
spending time with us today and telling us your story. It
You're
was
welcome.
incredible. Thank you.
You're
Yeah,
welcome.
really appreciate your honesty and your willingness to share with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me and doing this. Thanks for doing the work you're doing. It's really important.